In 1933, a soup kitchen cook in Chicago fed 400 people from a single pot of broth that cost less than $3 to make. A relief worker in that same kitchen kept a diary, and in it she wrote that number 12 on this list saved more lives that winter than the doctors did. Number 6 was banned from being served in New York relief wards by 1935, though no one wrote down exactly why. Number 1 was reserved only for the sick and the very old, because it was the only meal a starving body could still hold down. These 20 recipes were not created for flavor. They were created because millions of Americans stood in bread lines with empty bowls, and someone had to decide what could stretch furthest and cost least. Most of these soups vanished from memory the moment prosperity returned, and no cookbook ever wrote them down properly. Subscribe now, because by the end of this list, you will understand exactly what survival tasted like. Let us begin with number 20, Soup Line Rice Water Gruel.
This was the meal at the very bottom of the ladder, the one served when a relief kitchen had almost nothing left to give. A pot of water, a handful of rice, and a pinch of salt simmered until the grains broke apart and clouded the water into something thin and pale and barely resembling food at all. There was no meat, no vegetable, no fat of any kind. It existed for one reason only: to put something warm into an empty stomach when the pantry shelves behind the soup kitchen counter were bare. Records from a relief kitchen in St. Louis in 1930 to describe ladling this gruel to more than 600 people in a single afternoon, most of them children waiting in line before school. A volunteer at that kitchen later said the rice was often stretched so thin that the bowl looked like little more than cloudy water, yet the line never grew shorter. Families returned again and again because, thin as it was, it kept a person standing through another day of searching for work. Nutritionists today would call this meal nearly worthless, and by modern standards, it was, but in the depth of the Depression, calories were not measured in nutrients. They were measured in survival. A single 50-pound sack of rice, donated by a local mill, could produce this gruel for an entire neighborhood for nearly a week. No one wrote this recipe down in a cookbook, because no one who lived through it wanted to remember eating it. It survives only in relief kitchen ledgers and the handful of oral histories collected from the last of the Depression generation, describing a bowl of rice water as the difference between eating and not eating at all. Number 19, Settlement House Lentil and Barley. Put settlement houses, the community centers built in poor immigrant neighborhoods in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, ran their own kitchens long before government relief programs existed. And this pot was one of their most reliable recipes. A cup of dried lentils, a handful of barley and onion, and enough water to cover it all simmered for over an hour until the lentils broke down and the barley swelled, thickening the whole pot into something dense enough to hold a spoon upright. The pairing was deliberate. Lentils alone cooked soft within 30 minutes, but barley took nearly twice as long and held its shape, giving the soup a texture that felt more like a meal and less like broth. Settlement house cooks, many of them Eastern European and Italian immigrant women running kitchens for their own communities, understood that a poor family needed to feel full, not simply fed. The Henry Street settlement in Manhattan documented serving a version of this soup to hundreds of families each week during the early 1930s, often alongside English classes and job placement services offered in the same building. For many new immigrants, this pot of lentils and barley was their first taste of American charity, and for their children, it became the meal remembered decades later as the flavor of survival in a new country. Lentils and barley together cost only a few cents a pound, and a single large pot could be stretched across an entire settlement house dining hall. No restaurant serves this combination today, and the recipe survives only in the handwritten ledgers kept by settlement house volunteers. women whose names rarely appear anywhere else in the historical record. Number 18. Migrant Camp Squash Soup. In the Dust Bowl migrant camps of California's Central Valley, families who had lost everything in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas found themselves working fields full of squash they could not afford to buy and were only allowed to eat when it was too damaged or too small to sell. Camp cooks learned to make a soup out of exactly that, the cracked and undersized squash the growers threw aside, simmered down with water, a little salt, and whatever onion could be spared. The squash broke apart easily as it cooked, turning the water into a thick, faintly sweet broth within half an hour. There was rarely any meat, and rarely any dairy, since both were far beyond what a migrant family earning a few cents an hour could manage. What made the soup bearable, according to accounts collected from camp residents, was the squash itself, abundant in a way almost nothing else in the camp was. Since it grew wild along the edges of the fields the families were hired to pick, Federal Farm Security Administration camps, built to house migrant workers starting in the mid-1930s, often ran communal kitchens where this soup was served nightly during harvest season. Photographers documenting the camps for the government occasionally noted the smell of squash simmering over open fires. One of the few consistent meals available to families who moved from field to field with the seasons. This soup left no written recipe behind because the families who made it were rarely the ones whose stories were recorded. It survives only in a handful of oral histories and the photographs of camp kitchens taken during the worst years of the migration west. Number 17. Charity Ward Beef Tea. Before antibiotics and modern intravenous nutrition, hospitals and charity wards relied on a simple preparation to keep the sick and the elderly alive when they could hold down almost nothing else. Beef tea was not a soup in the usual sense. It was the liquid drawn slowly from a piece of tough, cheap beef, simmered 4 hours over the lowest possible heat until the meat released its essence into the water without ever fully cooking through. The method mattered as much as the ingredient. A pound of shin beef or other inexpensive cut was placed in a jar with a small amount of water sealed, and set into a pot of simmering water for 3 or 4 hours, a process closer to a slow infusion than actual cooking. What emerged was a thin, deeply savory liquid, almost entirely free of fat, that a weakened body could absorb with almost no effort at all. Charity wards and almshouse infirmaries across American cities served beef tea through the early 20th century and into the Depression years, when hospitals serving the poor stretched every ounce of meat as far as it could go. Nurses often prepared it themselves, since the process required attention rather than skill, and a single pound of beef could produce beef tea for a patient across several days. Medical journals of the era debated its nutritional value for decades. Yet it remained a fixture of charity hospital care simply because it worked, keeping frail patients alive long enough to recover or to receive whatever help came next. No hospital serves beef tea today, and the practice survives only in old nursing manuals and the handwritten ward logs of institutions that no longer exist. Number 16. Depression Diner. Slumgullion. Long before it became a punchline for bad food, Slumgullion was a serious meal, served in relief kitchens and cut-rate diners that sprang up in nearly every American town during the Depression. The name itself came from old mining camp slang for a thin, watery stew, and the meal that took its place in soup kitchen ledgers of the 1930s stayed true to that origin. A loose combination of whatever ground meat scraps, canned tomatoes, and macaroni a kitchen had on hand, stretched with water until it fed as many people as possible. Relief kitchen cooks treated the recipe less as a fixed formula and more as an instruction. Use the cheapest ground meat available, brown it, add canned tomatoes and a handful of pasta, and thin the whole pot until it served twice as many bowls as the ingredients alone would suggest. A diner in Ohio advertising a 5-cent bowl of Slumgullion in 1934 was not selling a specialty. It was selling the only thing on the menu most of its customers could afford. What separated Soup Kitchen Slumgullion from a home-cooked version was volume and intent. Relief cooks were not feeding a family of 4. They were feeding a line that stretched around the block, and the recipe had to be endlessly expandable with a little more water and a little more macaroni without losing the illusion of a real meal. The dish disappeared from menus almost entirely once the economy recovered, remembered today mostly as an insult rather than the meal that kept diners in business and bread lines fed through the worst years of the Depression. Number 15. Soup Kitchen Split Bean Gruel. Split beans, cheaper and more available to relief kitchens than the split peas home cooks favored, formed the base of one of the most heavily rationed soups served during the Depression. A large sack of dried split beans purchased in bulk by relief organizations at a fraction of retail cost was simmered for hours in plain water with almost nothing added beyond salt, until the beans dissolved completely into a thick, pale gruel with no trace of their original shape remaining. Unlike the ham-enriched split pea soup served in some middle-class kitchens of the era, this soup kitchen version rarely saw meat of any kind. Relief budgets could not stretch to bones or scraps for every pot, and cooks learned that split beans alone, cooked long enough, produced a broth dense enough to feel filling even without fat or flavoring. Some kitchens added a spoonful of bacon drippings when they had it, a small luxury that made a noticeable difference to those waiting in line. Chicago Relief Kitchen records from 1930 to describe split bean gruel as one of the most consistently served soups of the winter months, prized by administrators because a single sack of dried beans could be stretched, with enough water and enough time on the stove, to feed several hundred people across multiple servings. The soup demanded almost nothing beyond patience and a low flame, which made it ideal for relief kitchens operating with minimal staff and minimal equipment. It disappeared from memory almost entirely once split peas, with their faster cooking time and better flavor, became the preferred pantry staple in the decades that followed. Number 14. Breadcrust and onion broth. When a soup kitchen ran short on nearly everything else, stale bread became the meal itself. Bakeries across Depression-era cities donated their unsold crusts and heels of bread rather than throw them away, and relief kitchens turned that donation into a broth that needed almost nothing beyond what was already sitting in a bin by the back door. Crusts were torn into pieces, dropped into a pot with sliced onion and water, and simmered until the bread dissolved completely, thickening the liquid into a rough, starchy broth with a faint sweetness from the softened onion. The soup asked for no meat, no fat beyond what little a kitchen might spare, and no measuring of any kind, since the amount of bread available changed from one donation to the next. Cooks judged it ready by texture alone, thick enough to coat a spoon, thin enough to still be called a soup rather than a porridge. A relief kitchen in Detroit, operating out of a converted church basement in 1933, recorded receiving bread donations from more than a dozen local bakeries each week, enough to keep this broth on the menu almost daily through the coldest months. Volunteers noted that it was often the only hot meal some families received before nightfall, made entirely from what would otherwise have been thrown away. The recipe left the historical record almost as quietly as it entered it, remembered only in the donation ledgers of long-closed bakeries and the relief kitchen logs that tracked exactly how many crusts turned into how many bowls of broth each winter. Number 13. WPA commodity corn and milk soup. When the Works Progress Administration began distributing surplus government commodities to relief kitchens in the mid-1930s, canned corn and powdered milk arrived by the crate, and cooks built an entire soup around simply combining the two. a can of government corn, a portion of reconstituted powdered milk, and water made up the whole of it, heated gently until the corn softened further and the milk lent the broth a faint, chalky sweetness that bore little resemblance to fresh cream but filled the same purpose. The commodities themselves were not chosen for taste. They were surplus crops and dairy the federal government purchased from struggling farmers to stabilize collapsing agricultural prices, then redirected to relief kitchens rather than letting them go to waste. Powdered milk in particular was notorious among relief workers for its thin, slightly bitter flavor. Once reconstituted, yet it remained one of the few reliable sources of protein and calcium available to kitchens feeding hundreds of people a day. Relief kitchen administrators favored this soup specifically because both ingredients arrived already processed and shelf-stable, requiring no butchering, no chopping, and almost no skill to prepare, which mattered enormously in kitchens often staffed by volunteers rather than trained cooks. A single crate of commodity corn could produce this soup for an entire week's worth of servings. The soup vanished from memory almost the moment the commodity distribution programs wound down, tied so closely to a specific federal program that once the crates stopped arriving, no cook had any reason to make it again. It survives only in WPA kitchen inventories and the ration ledgers kept by relief administrators tracking exactly how surplus corn and powdered milk became supper for families with nothing else. Number 12. Skid Row fish head chowder. In the waterfront relief kitchens of cities like San Francisco, Baltimore, and Seattle, fish heads and other cast-off parts, refused by fish markets and restaurants because no paying customer would order them, became the foundation of a chowder that fed some of the poorest men in America. Fishermen and market vendors donated what they could not sell, heads, tails, and bones still carrying enough meat to matter, and relief cooks simmered them for hours with water, potatoes, and onion until the broth turned rich and cloudy with everything the bones had to give. The chowder required none of the delicate handling a proper filet demanded. Cooks boiled the heads whole, then strained the broth to remove bone before adding diced potato and whatever onion was on hand, letting the mixture simmer until the potatoes softened and thickened the pot into something substantial enough to be called a meal. Salt was often the only seasoning available, though some kitchens near the docks had access to donated pepper or bay leaf from local grocers. Seattle's waterfront missions, feeding the transient and unemployed men who gathered near the docks searching for day labor, served versions of this chowder through much of the 1930s, relying on the daily generosity of fish markets that would otherwise have discarded the heads entirely. A relief worker's account from that era described the smell of the chowder simmering as the closest thing to comfort some of those men experienced in a day defined by rejection and searching. The recipe disappeared once fish markets found other uses for their scraps, and no modern chowder recipe traces its roots back to what was, for a time, one of the only hot meals available to men living on the margins of American cities. Number 11. Relief kitchen cabbage water. At the leanest relief kitchens, the ones serving the largest crowds with the smallest budgets, cabbage was not cooked as a vegetable at all. It was boiled down until almost nothing remained but the water left behind, and that water, faintly green, faintly bitter, and completely free of the cabbage itself, became the soup. Whole heads of cabbage, often the outer leaves too tough or too damaged for market sale, were dropped into enormous pots of water and simmered for hours, then strained and ladled out as broth alone. The logic was ruthless but effective. A single head of cabbage, worth only pennies, could flavor several gallons of water, and a relief kitchen serving hundreds of people a day needed volume above all else. Nutritionally, the broth offered little, but it was hot, it was salted when salt could be spared, and it filled a bowl in front of a person who had been standing in line since before sunrise. Kitchens in industrial cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, overwhelmed by the sheer number of unemployed steelworkers and their families during the worst years of the Depression, relied on cabbage water as a stopgap when meat, beans, and grain ran short before the next donation arrived. Volunteers described it less as a meal and more as a bridge, something to hold a person over until a more substantial soup could be served the following day. No trace of this recipe survives in any cookbook, since it was never intended to be replicated outside of crisis. It remains only in the relief kitchen logs that recorded, almost apologetically, the days when cabbage water was the only thing left to serve. Number 10. Salt pork and hominy stew. Hominy, dried corn kernels treated to remove the tough outer hull, was a Southern relief kitchen staple long before the Depression made it a necessity for kitchens. Further north, cheap, filling, and slow to spoil, it paired naturally with salt pork, the fattiest and least expensive cut a butcher could offer, to create a stew that stretched a small amount of meat across an enormous pot. The salt pork was diced and rendered slowly until it released its fat. Then hominy and water were added and left to simmer for well over an hour, until the kernels softened and swelled, absorbing the rendered fat and thickening the broth into something dense enough to eat with a fork, rather than drink from a bowl. Onion, when available, went in early to soften alongside the pork. Little else was needed, since the fat alone carried most of the flavor. Relief kitchens across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee served this stew through the 1930s, relying on hominy purchased in bulk from local mills at a fraction of the cost of rice or wheat flour. Salt pork, cured and shelf-stable without refrigeration, could be stored for weeks, making it one of the few reliable fat sources a relief kitchen could stock in advance rather than depend on daily donations. The stew faded from relief kitchen menus as government commodity programs shifted toward canned goods and potted staples later in the decade, and it never returned to popularity once fresher, faster cooking grains became widely available. It survives today only in a handful of Southern relief kitchen records and the memories of a generation that grew up eating hominy because there was rarely anything else in the pot. Number 9. Poorhouse peat porridge. Long before the Depression, almshouses and poorhouses across America served a thick peat porridge to residents who had nowhere else to turn. A recipe so old it predated the nation itself. Revived and mass-produced once again when relief kitchens of the 1930s needed something cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin. Dried yellow peas, simmered for hours in plain water with nothing more than salt, broke down completely into a thick, pale porridge dense enough to stand a spoon upright in the pot. The recipe traced its roots to colonial-era poor relief, when almshouses fed the destitute, the elderly, and the orphaned on whatever grain or legume could be purchased in the largest possible bulk. By the 1930s, relief kitchen administrators rediscovered the same logic. Dried peas were cheap, stored for months without spoiling, and required no butchering, no chopping, and almost no skill beyond patience at the stove. Kitchens in New England, where the tradition of peat porridge ran deepest, served it through the coldest months of the Depression, often ladling it into the same tin bowls that almshouses had used for a century before. A relief worker in Boston noted in 1933 that elderly residents recognized the porridge immediately, some remembering it from childhood poorhouses decades earlier, a meal that had somehow outlived the century that created it. No modern kitchen serves peat porridge in its original form, and the recipe survives only in almshouse records and the relief kitchen ledgers of a handful of New England cities that kept the tradition live into the 1930s out of necessity rather than nostalgia. Number 8. Cornmeal mush soup. Cornmeal, ground from dried corn and stored for months without spoiling, sat at the center of Depression relief kitchen pantries, and one of its simplest uses was thinned into a mush that toed the line between soup and porridge. Cooks stirred cornmeal slowly into boiling water, whisking constantly to prevent lumps, until the mixture thickened just enough to hold together while still loose enough to ladle into a bowl and drink. As much as eat. A pinch of salt was often the only addition, though some kitchens stirred in a spoonful of bacon drippings when they had it, giving the mush a faint smokiness that made it feel closer to a real meal. The recipe demanded almost no skill beyond patience at the stove, since scorched cornmeal ruined an entire pot in seconds. A lesson relief kitchen volunteers learned quickly and passed down to whoever stood at the stove. Next, Southern and Midwestern relief kitchens leaned heavily on cornmeal mush soup because cornmeal itself was among the cheapest staples available in bulk, purchased by the sack from local mills at a fraction of the cost of wheat flour or rice. A single 50-pound sack could stretch across weeks of servings, making it one of the most reliably budgeted items on a relief kitchen's shopping list. The soup disappeared from memory almost entirely once wheat-based staples became more affordable after the Depression ended, and cornmeal mush itself shifted from a meal in its own right to a breakfast side dish. It survives today only as a fragment of relief kitchen history, remembered by almost no one outside the ledgers that recorded exactly how many sacks of cornmeal became supper for families with nothing else on the shelf. Number 7. Government cheese and rice gruel surplus. Government cheese, purchased by federal agricultural programs to prop up dairy farmers struggling through collapsing milk prices, arrived at relief kitchens in enormous blocks by the mid-1930s, and cooks learned to stretch it as far as possible by melting it into a simple rice gruel. A cup of rice simmered in water until soft formed the base, and shredded government cheese was stirred in, at the end melting into the starchy liquid until it turned thick pale orange and faintly tangy. The cheese itself was not chosen for flavor. It was a byproduct of federal price stabilization efforts, processed and pressed into blocks specifically because it stored well and shipped easily to relief kitchens across the country. Cooks quickly discovered that a small amount went a long way once melted into rice, turning a nearly flavorless grain into something that tasted, however faintly, like an actual meal rather than plain starch and water. Relief kitchens receiving federal commodity shipments prioritized this gruel specifically because both ingredients required almost no preparation, no butchering, and no chopping, which mattered in kitchens run largely by volunteers with little formal cooking experience. A single block of commodity cheese, weighing several pounds, could season enormous batches of rice across multiple servings in a single week. The recipe vanished almost entirely once commodity distribution programs evolved, and government cheese became associated instead with block cheese giveaways of later decades, disconnected from the rice gruel that first made use of it. It survives only in WPA kitchen inventories and the ration records of relief administrators who tracked, week by week, how many blocks of surplus cheese became supper for families waiting in line. Number 6. Oxtail and turnip broth. Butchers in Depression-era cities routinely discarded oxtail, considering it a scrap cut with too much bone and too little meat to interest-paying customers. And relief kitchens turned that rejection into one of the richest broths on this entire list. A few pounds of oxtail, donated or purchased for almost nothing, were browned first, then simmered for hours with turnips and water until the connective tissue broke down completely, releasing a broth so thick with natural gelatin that it thickened on its own without any flour or thickener added. Turnips, cheap, hearty, and available through the coldest months when few other vegetables survived, softened into the broth as it cooked, absorbing the deep, almost beefy richness the oxtail released over hours on the stove. The long cooking time meant almost no active effort was required beyond keeping the pot at a low simmer, ideal for relief kitchens that needed to prepare enormous batches with minimal staff attention throughout the day. Kitchens in cities with active meat-packing industries, including Chicago and Kansas City, had steady access to oxtail specifically because slaughterhouses produced far more of it than butcher counters could sell, making it one of the more dependable protein sources a relief kitchen could count on week after week. A relief kitchen supervisor in Chicago noted in 1934 that oxtail broth was often the only meal served that contained any real meat flavor at all, a small luxury built entirely from what the meat industry considered waste. The broth disappeared from relief kitchen menus as meat packing practices changed and oxtail found its way into higher-priced specialty dishes decades later, leaving this original relief kitchen version forgotten almost entirely outside a handful of surviving kitchen ledgers. Number 5. Breadline barley soup. Barley, cheap, filling, and slow to spoil, became one of the most heavily served grains in relief kitchens, feeding the long lines that formed outside soup kitchens each morning during the worst years of the Depression. A large pot of water, a generous handful of barley, an onion if one could be spared, and salt made up the entirety of the recipe. Simmered for well over an hour until the grains swelled and softened, thickening the broth into something substantial enough to be called a real meal rather than plain water. Relief kitchen administrators favored barley specifically because it expanded dramatically as it cooked, meaning a relatively small quantity could stretch across hundreds of servings without requiring additional ingredients. Unlike rice, which softened quickly and lost its shape, barley held its structure through hours of simmering, allowing kitchens to keep a pot on low heat all morning without worrying about it breaking down into mush before the line had been served. Bread lines in cities like New York and Chicago, some stretching for entire city blocks by 1932, relied on barley soup as a dependable base precisely because it required so little beyond time and a low flame. Volunteers described it as the soup that never ran short, since a single sack of barley purchased in bulk at a fraction of the cost of meat or fresh vegetables could be portioned out across an entire morning's line without ever needing to turn someone away. The soup faded from memory once bread lines themselves disappeared with economic recovery, and barley shifted from a relief kitchen staple to a minor ingredient in soups built around richer, more expensive bases. It survives today only in the daily serving logs kept by soup kitchen administrators tracking exactly how many bowls a single sack of barley could produce. Number 4. Dandelion green pottage. When relief kitchen budgets ran too thin even for the cheapest canned vegetables, cooks turned to what grew freely along roadsides, vacant lots, and the edges of city parks. Dandelion greens, considered a weed by anyone with the means to buy real produce, became the base of a pottage that cost nothing beyond the labor of picking them. The greens were simmered with bacon fat when it was available, and a small amount of cornmeal to thicken the pot, creating something between a soup and a stew, bitter, earthy, and filling in a way few people today would expect from a plant most consider a nuisance. Foraging for dandelion greens became so common during the Depression that some cities issued informal guidance on where it was safe to pick them, away from roads treated with tar and away from lots where chemicals might have been used. Relief kitchen volunteers and desperate families alike gathered greens by the bagful each spring, when the plants were at their most tender, and dried or preserved what they could not use immediately for the leaner months ahead. Appalachian and rural Midwestern relief kitchens leaned on dandelion pottage especially heavily, since foraging traditions in those regions predated the Depression by generations, passed down through families who had always supplemented their diets with wild greens during hard years. A relief kitchen worker in West Virginia recalled entire families arriving with sacks of foraged greens to trade for a hot meal an early and unofficial version of bartering that kept many kitchens stocked through the leanest weeks of spring. The recipe disappeared almost entirely once grocery store produce became affordable and plentiful again, and dandelion greens returned to their old reputation as a weed rather than a meal, remembered now only in a handful of Appalachian oral histories. Number 3. Prison Camp Bean Broth. Federal relief camps established under the Works Progress Administration and its predecessor programs housed thousands of unemployed men in the mid-1930s, many of them assigned to labor on roads, dams, and public works projects far from home. And the kitchens feeding those camps relied on a bean broth built for volume above all else. Dried beans, purchased by the ton for camp kitchens serving hundreds of men at once, were simmered for hours in enormous kettles with almost nothing beyond salt and whatever onion could be sourced locally, producing a broth thin enough to serve quickly but filling enough to sustain a full day of physical labor. Camp cooks operated under strict budget limits set by federal administrators, often just a few cents per man per meal, which meant the broth rarely saw meat of any kind, beyond an occasional ham bone donated by a nearby farm. What the broth lacked in richness it made up for in sheer scale, kettles large enough to feed an entire camp in a single batch, ladled out at long communal tables before men returned to their work assignments for the afternoon. Camps stationed in remote areas, particularly those building roads and dams in mountainous regions, depended on this broth specifically because dried beans shipped and stored easily over long distances without spoiling. Unlike fresh meat or produce that camp supply trucks could not always deliver reliably. A camp administrator's report from 1935 noted that bean broth was served at nearly every camp under his supervision at least 4 times a week, simply because nothing else stretched as far on so little money. The recipe vanished from memory once the relief camp system wound down by the end of the decade, surviving today only in federal camp administration records and the labor reports filed by the men who oversaw them. Number 2. Mulligan stew. Long before it entered soup kitchen ledgers, Mulligan stew belonged to the hobo camps that sprang up along railroad lines throughout the Depression. Communal pots shared by transient men riding freight cars in search of work, each contributing whatever scrap of food he had managed to find or beg that day. One man might bring a stolen potato, another a handful of carrots pulled from a farmer's field, another a small piece of meat traded for labor, and all of it went into a single pot simmered over an open fire at the edge of the rail yard. The recipe had no fixed ingredients by design, since it depended entirely on what the group could gather collectively rather than what any one person could afford alone. This unpredictability became the stew's defining trait, and relief kitchens that later adopted the name and concept embraced the same philosophy, combining donated scraps, de-old vegetables, and whatever meat trimmings a local butcher could spare into a single pot that changed slightly with every batch. Railroad camps near major rail hubs, including those outside Chicago and Kansas City, became known among traveling men for reliably hosting a Mulligan stew pot each evening, an informal system of mutual survival that required no money, only a willingness to contribute and to share. Relief kitchens in nearby towns eventually formalized the same idea indoors, serving a more consistent version to men who had given up rail travel but still carried the habits and expectations of camp life within. The stew's name endured longer than most on this list, though its original meaning, a pot built entirely from communal scraps and mutual trust among strangers, faded once relief kitchens standardized their recipes, and the hobo camps that created it disappeared along with the Depression itself. Number 1. Hoover stew. No dish carried more bitterness in its name than Hoover stew, a direct jab at President Herbert Hoover. blamed by millions of unemployed Americans for the economic collapse that put them in soup kitchen lines in the first place. The recipe itself was almost insultingly simple. Slice hot dogs or whatever cheap sausage a kitchen could source, canned corn, canned tomatoes, and elbow macaroni, all simmered together in one pot until the flavors merged into something that resembled a real dinner far more than its ingredients suggested it should. Relief kitchens across the country served versions of this stew by the thousands of bowls each week, prized specifically because every component was shelf-stable, inexpensive, and available in bulk from canneries eager to move surplus stock during a collapsing economy. The hot dogs, often the cheapest protein a relief kitchen could buy, gave the stew a smoky, meaty presence that made it feel far more substantial than a simple vegetable and pasta pot. Bonus Army veterans camped in Washington in 1932, protesting for early payment of promised bonuses, reportedly ate versions of this same stew in their makeshift camps along the Anacostia River, the name itself becoming a bitter piece of protest as much as a recipe. The stew's association with Hoover stuck so firmly that even decades later, relief workers who lived through the era still refused to call it anything else. Hoover stew disappeared from kitchens almost the moment the political anger that named it faded, and later generations who encountered similar combinations of hot dogs and macaroni never connected it back to the bread lines and protest camps where it was born. 20 recipes, and not one of them was designed to taste good. They were designed to keep a person alive one more day using whatever a relief kitchen, a rail yard, or a roadside ditch could provide for free. Somewhere behind every bowl on this list stood a cook, a volunteer, or a mother who refused to let hunger win, even when there was almost nothing left to work with. If even one of these recipes surprised you or reminded you of a story your own grandparents told, type the number in the comments right now. Tell me which one hit hardest, and tell me if your family had a version of their own that never made it into any cookbook. Subscribe and stay, because the next list uncovers 20 more recipes history tried to forget, and I promise you, some of them will be even harder to believe.